Panic in Philly. Shocking. Who's the MVP? We got 2 voters on this show, so I figure we'll figure it out. And Chicago has a bear of a problem they've got to figure out. We've got all that and more. I'm Jason Fitz, and it's time for Inside Coverage. Welcome to Inside Coverage. Yahoo Sports senior NFL reporters Charles Robinson, Jori Epstein. I'm Jason Fitz. Got a ton to get into. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a wild week in the NFL through chaos and change for bad teams, but also for good teams. So let's just dive right into the news of the day. And one thing that I thought was a little bit curious, the Eagles make Matt Patricia their defensive play caller, which to me, C-Rob, just seemed a little bit shocking. I know we've talked on this show about 2 new coordinators, both sides of the ball. Maybe there's an adjustment period for the Eagles, but to be this far into the season and make this change at this time, what's it mean?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to be honest about this whole thing. A lot of people are saying, well, this is a Nick Sirianni-inspired move, but if you know the history of Philadelphia, you know it has an owner and a general manager who want some pliability on the coaching staff. They ran into issues with Doug Peterson at the end of his regime there. Doug got to a point where he was like, look, I'm no longer making coaching staff changes based on what the general manager and the owner want. I'm going to do what I want to do with my staff. And that's when they decided to part company. Nick Sirianni comes in with a little more pliability. So look, if staff changes need to be made, if decisions need to be altered during the course of the season based on the layers above Nick Sirianni, that's going to happen. I think that's really what inspired this. I think you have a general manager and an owner in Howie Roseman and Jeffrey Lurie who look at that defensive roster and say, we're not getting enough out of this. The previous 3 games prior to the Seattle loss, the EPA for that defense went off a cliff. I mean, they were basically the bottom of the league. Now they faced 3 good opponents, but still, for what the talent level is, I think you had a front office and an owner who was basically saying, look, we need to get more out of this. And one thing I would say to focus this too, Sean Desai, he's not the defensive coordinator anymore. He's defensive coordinator in name, but if you're not operating the scheme, if you're not calling plays, if you're not shaping how you're approaching teams schematically, you're no longer the coordinator. Matt Patricia is that guy. And how did we end up here? Remember going back to the end of last season, the Eagles had to wait until after the Super Bowl when they lost Jonathan Gannon to replace their defensive coordinator. So you're in a situation where you don't have the pick of the litter, right? And they didn't just lose Jonathan Gannon. They lost Vic Fangio. Vic Fangio was a defensive advisor for this franchise. He was a very good voice in that room, helped quite a bit, and then he ends up being the defensive coordinator in Miami. So it's a confluence of a lot of different things that led to this point. But ultimately, I think the change happens because you had a general manager and an owner looking at that roster saying, this defense is good enough to compete. It's good enough to not be giving up 30-plus points a game. That did not happen. 3 games in a row heading into the Seattle game. And I think that's ultimately how Matt Patricia ended up taking over the controls.
Yeah, when I'm listening to Nick Sirianni talk after that Monday night loss to Seattle, that's their 3rd straight loss, the first since they made the defensive coordinator change, I'm like having flashbacks to Robert Saleh discussing the Zach Wilson decision in the sense of you're listening to what they're saying and how they're saying it and trying to decide who actually made this decision. And to Nick's credit, the same way that it was Robert's party line when he made the Zach credit, he's like, I made the decision, I did this. And then you ask him when, and he's like, I don't remember which day during this week that I made the decision, like during the game planning process. And he's in a sticky spot. Like I know someone was saying like, he's got to earn back trust with the Philly media. I mean, did he tell them that he was keeping the coordinator as is on Monday when he probably knew it was coming? Yes. But did he more say that he wanted to keep the coordinator the same, which I believe could be true? Yes. I think that it's really complicated making a change this late in the season. And while you don't want to get complacent with where you are, I think they're saying, like, we know we're not going to win the Super Bowl and we're not going to go all the way, which is what Philly was aiming for. I know every team isn't like a macro sense, but this team legitimately thought that they were in contending range this season, and now they don't feel that way. So I don't know. And to add to what C-Rob said, he did say Matt Patricia has the final say on any decisions on the defense. So before, when Sean Desai was calling the plays and making these final decisions, the 2 were in conversation during the game. Nick Sirianni said on the headset on Monday night against Seattle, that was the same process, just switched. And while they will have a little bit of a stretch to get right before playoffs, because they'll face the Giants, the Cardinals, and then the Giants again, I still feel like, one, there's only so much tape on Tommy DeVito out there, so not to give him too much credit, but I don't think it's like the perfect situation to face when you have a new play caller. And then against Arizona, I still believe that Jonathan Gannon, who they formerly had as their defensive coordinator last year, will know as well as anybody what to do against that Philly offense, even if he doesn't have the talent that in theory should be able to beat them. So I think that they should be fine, but I don't think it's going to be smooth sailing the next 3 weeks as they get right for the playoffs.
Isn't there some element of this, though? Like, in my mind, Sirianni has at least earned the autonomy with his success to be able to put who he wants in these roles. And we're really critical of other coaches and really critical of other ownership groups when they meddle. And at some point, we're looking at this like, I'm not sure what message this sends to coordinators that want to work for Sirianni, because apparently he has the ability to hire you but not keep you around in that job. And the other side of it is like, let's be real here. San Francisco went through a 3-game losing streak also. They didn't panic. I know that we can look at it and say, well, his injuries were part of it, but this feels like a panic move from a team that's contending for a Super Bowl, doesn't it, C-Rob?
Yeah, I mean, well, first off, Nick Sirianni, in terms of having some autonomy, his staff was built with the help of the front office. I mean, it wasn't like he went in and said, okay, I'm just going to go grab all these pieces. These are all my decisions. That's just not the way it works in Philly. People shouldn't be upset about that because they went to a Super Bowl. They won a Super Bowl with Doug Peterson in a situation where Doug wasn't always making decisions with his coaching staff after the season ended. And again, that's just how this organization wants to run, with some pliability that they can say, the front office can say, look, we've built this roster. This is what we put together. This is how we expect it to run. If it's not running right, we're not getting rid of the head coach, but there are going to be other pieces and parts that we want to be able to finesse. And so, look, some organizations just run this way. Others don't. In terms of future coordinators, things like that, sure, you should know that going in. But in terms of the panic, as you said with San Francisco, a lot of that really was truly predicated on injuries. We've seen what that offense can look like without Deebo Samuel. We've seen what that offense can look like with a beat up Christian McCaffrey. You have Trent Williams. You take him off of that offensive line, and you can see the impact that has. This was not an injury situation in Philly. This was a scheme situation. It was a play calling situation. They were not good in the red zone. Okay, they were falling behind in games, and you have to call your defense considerably differently when you're running from behind. They weren't able to rush the passer the way that they had hoped. Even the front end of the defense, which is clearly the talent, is the front end, that defensive line. You're having struggles stopping the run game. It's just a multitude of different things. I think the one thing that happens here that really maybe is a little more eyebrow raising than anything else is that the change happened in the season. It didn't happen after the season. Whereas in the past, that's usually what occurred, was that there were conversations that took place. Again, that pliability with the front office, the owner, and the head coach, there was an ability to maneuver pieces. For it to happen in season is very suggestive that, again, I think Howie Roseman, the general manager, I think Jeffrey Lurie, the owner, and I think Nick Sirianni, the head coach as well, are all sitting there going, we're not going to be a Super Bowl team if this is how our defense is playing. We can't play top tier offenses, give up 30 plus points, and have our defensive EPA 30th, 31st, and that's really what happened in a succession of games. And it was not because of injuries. So we can say that it's a little bit of panic, but I think there was some reality to the talent was on the field. It was not performing. What can you change in that situation? They can't go out and acquire other veterans. The pieces are the pieces at this point. The only thing they could do is try to shake it up. And I will say this, I do think there's an element of this trying to shake things up. I don't think it's just, hey, the play calling was just bad, or the scheming during the course of the week, what we set in place for our opponents was just bad. I think there is this is shaking things up in the locker room. It's shaking things up in the coaching staff. You're trying to get a spark and some traction with a move like this in season.
Yeah, Fitz, to your question about coordinators, I don't expect them to have any issue recruiting coordinators. I mean, pair this situation with another one that didn't have stability this year, that being the Carolina Panthers. That is a temperamental owner, a team that's not winning, a team that doesn't have the assets, versus Philly, which has shown they know how to do it. They have several different formulas that have worked to get there. And if you do well, which you will have the pieces to do, you'll have the scheme support to do, and you'll have the players to do, then you can keep your job. So I think that you're way better set up for success in Philly than you are in most places around the league. That doesn't mean you're not going to have some degree of oversight and accountability, but I think that you're starting off with a much better place to succeed. as it relates to this like panic mode, I think the problem is that what happened against San Francisco to me was not a reason to panic, because it's San Francisco. They're insanely good. They can do that to anybody. And maybe you get back at them in the playoffs, but like, I don't think that's why you make a change. And even the loss to the Cowboys, I mean, you can argue the offense was a bigger issue. They had no offensive touchdowns for their starters for the first time in 7 years. And then you change the defensive coordinator after that. I think where you start to panic is when you say, okay, well, now we can't be Drew Lock and the Seahawks. This is not even Geno Smith. This is Drew Lock. And you have a defense that has not been great for Seattle. And to me, that starts to show that like sort of this outside noise, or maybe even inside noise, you can call it. I think both are accurate, is getting into the building. And I think you see that in Jalen Hurts' comments this week. You see that when how many times can A.J. Brown say he's not discouraged, just disappointed? I thought it was well put the first couple times. So the more you say it, the more you have to wonder if there is some discouragement as well on the team.
The Jalen Hurts comments are part of why I think I look at all this. And, I realize life isn't this simple. I'm oversimplifying. I will acknowledge that. But meddling owner at some point, a GM that wants control over who's standing on the sidelines, and a quarterback that's out here after a Monday Night Football loss calling out the team for having a lack of commitment. If there was a different, I understand the winning erases all of this, right? But it's just that usually if I stack those Legos up, it makes a castle of chaos. And that's all I'm looking at here. It feels like a castle of chaos to me.
I'm curious to hear what you think about that committed statement, because we both, I feel like, spent some time around Jalen Hurts, maybe not all of the time. And Jalen Hurts is a very philosophical guy. He's an old soul, and he talks in ways that I really have not heard any other player, and especially not quarterback, routinely talk. And so to me, when he said, we're not committed, and then they asked him what he meant by that, and he's like, I don't have a dictionary here. What do you want me to mean by that? Like, I don't think that he was calling out his teammates. You could say that he was making a very intentional message to his teammates, and maybe he was, but to me, he was by no means saying, I didn't do enough. He knows he threw the interceptions. He knew that when he was coming off this game where he was so sick that he flew on a separate plane so as not to infect his teammates, that he didn't play at his best, and that he also hasn't really been at his best the second half of the season, whether due to injury, scheme, or otherwise. But to me, I didn't view it as he was putting the blame on other people. I think he would say, starting with me, which he said routinely in that thing, like, I know as a quarterback, it starts with me. We got to pick ourselves out about it. I just thought that his use of the word committed got a little bit overblown.
He's a person that speaks with intention. So
that's fair.
To me, it's a word he chose. I don't know exactly what he meant by that. I question, what I would have liked to have heard him expound on it and not just say, well, what do you want me to mean by that? No, I want to know what you mean by that. Is it because you have a head coach who says, all right, we're going to, instead of going for it on 4th and 7, we're going to punt. We're going to put this on the hands of our defense and our new de facto defensive coordinator. And then a 92-yard drive happens and the defensive coordinator decides, 3rd and 10, I'm going to take James Bradbury, who's not a great man coverage guy, and I'm going to stick him one-on-one with Jackson Smith and Jigba and hope that, Drew Lock doesn't put it into a box in the end zone, which is exactly what happened. And then you lose this game. So I don't know if there's a frustration element of watching this unfold, where under normal circumstances, a defense that talented is not going to let a backup quarterback go 92 yards on you and then throw a dime to beat you. It's unfortunate, I think, that he chose that word and then didn't follow it up with, here's exactly what I mean by that, because there's so much room for interpretation when someone, as I said, as intentional as Jalen Hurts, he doesn't just throw words around, chooses such a big word about commitment, because you can point that in any direction. You really can in that organization when you're going through a losing streak like this. I do think, at the very least, watching that press conference, there wasn't an element of him shoving it off. He did take responsibility, obviously, for the mistakes that he made. But we also know, I don't think he was 100%. It's messy right now in Philly. But you know what? I also look out at the rest of the NFL. It's been messy everywhere. Dallas didn't exactly rock it against Buffalo, okay? It's not like San Francisco didn't have its hiccup in the middle of the season. It's not like Baltimore's been a perfect team from start to finish this year. I kind of feel like this is emblematic of really what the NFL is, and I know we've got 3 games left here. I have a sneaking suspicion that pretty much any team right now that we're dogging or celebrating could be the exact opposite 1 month from now when we're in the midst of the playoffs.
Which is, by the way, what makes this, I think, one of the most exciting seasons. I'm not sure these teams are good. It's just exciting. Like, I will say that. You're right. Now, from, coaching instability, let's look at some coaching stability, because we do have a matchup this weekend that gives us a couple of guys that are obviously Coach of the Year candidates. And I can't believe I'm saying this. This reminds us why in the summer we all need to calm down, because right now Houston, Cleveland looks like this juggernaut of Coach of the Year battle, right? But it's also Case Keenum versus Joe Flacco. I don't know what to make of that either. Case Keenum versus Joe Flacco isn't the matchup we thought we needed, but you have to look at this from CJ Stroud's point. Y'all tell me, because you guys have votes. We'll get into this in a minute on awards, right? But it feels like CJ Stroud, even on the sideline, clearly the Rookie of the Year, and it feels like we always like an unexpected situation to be Coach of the Year. So it still looks to me like DeMeco is the Coach of the Year. But this matchup will play forward for both of these teams to have a lot of playoff on the line, right?
I think it's so fun that we have so many coaches who legitimately feel deserving of Coach of the Year because of how much they're exceeding expectations. Like DeMeco Ryans, absolutely. I don't think someone's got a stronger case than him, but I think Shane Steichen in Indy, what he's doing, not to mention without his rookie quarterback. And then you have Kevin Stefanski to have 4 different quarterbacks winning games, to have gone through what you're going through with your defense. Like, I'm working on the story right now about the value of a backup quarterback and what we've learned about backup quarterbacks in the league scheme this year, and like this, or in a broader picture of the league. And to me, what Kevin Stefanski has been able to do to adjust to each of these quarterbacks every week so that his defense can still do what it needs to do, the offensive pieces can work. And I'm not saying it's beautiful and like without any sort of rocky moments, but I just think it's pretty unbelievable what they were able to do, that this franchise that sold out on Deshaun Watson in many senses of the word is winning routinely without him.
When I look at Cleveland, I will say Jim Schwartz is probably your assistant coach of the year, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, to me, that's the one major shift.
We're influencing betting odds here.
Joe Woods was not working there. Okay. The defensive players, Myles Garrett, so many guys were frustrated with what they were doing schematically, the way things were being called defensively. And then you have a front office there in Andrew Berry. They went into the offseason, Kevin Stefanski, and they said, look, Stefanski held out on Joe Woods as long as he could. I think he knew at that point, I got to make this change. And so what do? We go out and we get Jim Schwartz, who, by the way, really strong personality guy. I mean, he always has been. You can go all the way back to his days as a defensive coordinator in Tennessee. I mean, that's really when I met him first. And to me, it always struck me as not quite Greg Williams level, but a guy who will walk around your facility, especially when things are going well, with that chest way out. And so you have to have a special head coach who can go, all right, cool. I'm going to have a guy walking around the building who in some respects kind of feels like he owns the place at times. But look at what Jim Schwartz is doing on the field for the Cleveland Browns. So I think a lot of what started right for Kevin Stefanski was being able to make that coordinator change, knowing that it had to happen. And we're seeing what Schwartz has done. But as Jori said, multiple different quarterbacks. You got, really the centerpiece of your offense. Nick Chubb goes down early in the year. A lot of people kept burying them as these things were happening. The offensive line's been injured. Amari Cooper's dealt with injuries. I mean, it's from top to bottom on offense. There have been just a wide array of problems, and yet they have been able to weather this. And I think even going and getting Joe Flacco the way that they did, Joe, I kind of use this phrase a lot, but I do think it's the right one for him. He's getting them there. He's getting them to the destination, but he's sideswiping every car on the way. like it's not pretty, but ultimately it was the change that I think has helped them immensely. Just having a veteran back there, he's unlocked some different players on offense with the confidence and the arm strength that he has. Just the knowledge and also the ability to not panic. I mean, he's turning the ball over, and there are some guys who might go into the tank, and Flacco's just kind of like, yeah, I've thrown a lot of interceptions. I've done a lot of bonehead things over time. All right, I'm just going to go out there. We'll be fine. We'll just keep pressing. So Stefanski, I think, to me, really has a great argument for Coach of the Year. DeMeco, I'm here in Houston, completely changed the tenor of the franchise. The locker room, the organization on every single level. I mean, you probably go into the business end of the Houston Texans, and they're more excited and galvanized than they've ever been under a head coach in years. I mean, this to me, in some respects, that was like the greatest days of like Gary Kubiak. This is how good the building feels right now. So I think DeMeco as well. starting that rookie quarterback, although obviously Stroud's down now, has a great argument for it as well. But as Jori said, you can look across the NFL right now, and there are going to be probably 5-6 coaches that feel like and have a good argument for winning Coach of the Year.
All I know now is when I watch Joe Flacco play, I'm just going to think about the worst Uber trip I've ever taken, where like you get there, but in the process you think you're going to die 20 times, and then you're like, just one star.
Just let me out. I'll walk.
let me. You know how many times this season where I've like watched? Well, not that obviously this season, but since Flacco's gotten in there, Dawn's brother's huge Cleveland Browns fan, right? And how many times during their games I have just texted him in all caps, Flacco, like what did he just do? And then by the end of the game, he's like, we're all right. He got us there. That's all that matters.
Living by my motto of better to be lucky than good. All right. So when we start talking about coaches, I'm doing all this work with Rivals this week for National Recruiting Signing Day, right? And I've heard all these stories about how Harbaugh they're using recruiting against Harbaugh. They're going to Michigan kids and saying, but he's not going to get there. He's not going to be there. And Michigan guys are going there saying Ohio State, Ryan Day's not going to be there. So I got to ask you guys, with Harbaugh being in the conversation, frankly, as a Raiders fan, where's he going to end up? All right, C-Rob, is Harbaugh going to be in the NFL next year, or is he going to be in college football?
Well, here's an interesting thing about Harbaugh. Prior to the sign stealing investigation coming out, right? Like Michigan was confident that they were going to get him signed to a long-term contract. Now, there's been strife inside Michigan. Harbaugh and the athletic director, not best buds. Okay, probably not on each other's Christmas card list. He and Ward Manuel, not the fastest of friends, I will put it that way. And then I think you have an issue too with basically a president and a board of regents that are like, we want to get Harbaugh signed here. We want to get a long-term contract done. Sign stealing thing happens, contract doesn't occur. And then when it kind of dies down afterward and they're headed to play Alabama in the national championship, there was this dead period here where I thought, okay, it's going to happen. Like Michigan's going to get this done. It's going to be closed. And when you talk to people in the NFL, they're like, is he even going to be available? Like it seems like it's leaning back into Michigan. Well, here we are. There's still no contract extension signed. It should have been done by now. And I think it's lingered to the point where Harbaugh's going to know what his options were. Remember, Denver chased him, right? Denver wanted him. Ownership ultimately couldn't land him. So they end up with Sean Payton. The Minnesota experience, where I think he could have potentially had that job if it had not been some interesting things that happened with ownership. There were some elements of ownership that were not necessarily on board with the Jim Harbaugh hire. So I think if he wants to be in the NFL, he's going to have the opportunity to be in the NFL. If he wants to go to a team coaching wise, the Chargers, that's a good place to be. Maybe not general manager wise, but coaching wise, that's the roster that you probably would want to walk into.
You can't do this. You cannot do this. You cannot stick me in a division where now I'm taking on Harbaugh, Andy Reid, and Sean Payton for that. Like, for that, what? So what? The Raiders going to go hire Belichick? Like, what are you supposed to? Like, what are we doing in this division? He needs to stay out of the West. He can go anywhere, just out of the West, man. So that being said, it makes sense. Everything you're saying makes sense. But it's curious right now because it feels like it has dragged on so long, and there are some key openings out there for him, Jori.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's interesting. And also just like between Harbaugh and Belichick and all of these up and coming guys, like what do people want? Do you guys want offensive coaches? Do you guys want defensive coaches? I just feel like the types of like recipes that each of these organizations who have openings need, like what they all need is very different and how they're going to go for it. But I mean, where do you think Chargers? Do we think that's the best fit for him?
Well, okay, look, here's the thing about the Chargers. I think ownership, and this is having talked to someone in the building after Telesco went out, the general manager, and then obviously Brandon Staley. I think part of the apprehension on the side of ownership is if you go and you dip into another young candidate, they had great faith in Brandon Staley being able to put everything. He talked a good game, right? He sold himself well. I think on the tail end of this, though, they're like, we feel like we kind of need a resume here. We need someone who we've seen accomplish things as a head coach on the NFL level. We need someone who we've seen them have a direct impact on a quarterback. And I think the thing about Harbaugh that's enticing is he is a very commanding personality when he comes into your building. Great. That's what you want. He is someone that, remember, if you go back to the San Francisco team that went to the Super Bowl, that defense was filled with a ton of talent, but it was filled with a lot of guys that had strong personalities. You got to be able to commandeer that locker room back in San Francisco. And then you want someone that's going to be able to work with Justin Herbert. Well, Harbaugh was ahead of the curve with Colin Kaepernick. I think people forget that when he was running this pistol offense, people were like, is this really going to work? Like, is Colin Kaepernick? And there was a time where Colin Kaepernick was dynamic as hell. People thought he was going to run the league for 10 years. He was on Madden commercials. Like, we forget this period of Colin Kaepernick's career where he was a leading figure at the quarterback position and where it was going. Well, Jim Harbaugh did that. So in that respect, with the roster that they have, the talent that they have, wanting someone who has accomplished something as a head coach and really at every level, at Michigan, at Stanford, San Diego, the 49ers, everywhere he's gone, he has accomplished and turned programs in the right direction and built them good foundationally and built them well from a foundational standpoint. So to me, that's what makes sense in terms of what they need right now. Will he last if he goes into a place like that? I don't know. You know, there's a shelf life with Jim Harbaugh. He burns people out. Everybody knows you kind of have 5 years. And then like it just starts to really fray at the edges in terms of the people around him. He will wear you out.
Look, I'll take 5 years to good. I'm just saying that. By the way, we should acknowledge since the last time we talked, I think my beloved Raiders are the first team ever to fire a coach and get a coach fired in like a 2 weeks. Like that feels like that's good. Like they fired their coach and they got another coach fired. I mean, like, and by the way, also I was in the building for 3-0. Of course. There was not, I gave tickets to our buddy Frank Schwab. He was in the building for 63-21. Who the hell am I doing? I've just got, like, this has all gone wrong. This has all gone just drastically wrong for me. Okay. It never goes wrong when I can talk to you guys about MVP because I want to give a little shout out to both of you as we know you guys are the experts. And it's one of the things I love about doing this show with you is that you bring expertise in it. And that's an important caveat as we enter this conversation because you both have an MVP vote. So I want to stress this, like there's a difference between talking heads screaming about MVP and having people that actually vote on it talk about the MVP. So this is one of the weirder years, and obviously it's been a big conversation. So Jori, I'll start with you, like not even with where you are in this, because Purdy's the favorite right now, according to BetMGM, Lamar second, CMC, Dak third. In your mind, how much of an emphasis is put on the quarterback position specifically for the MVP conversation?
Yeah, it's something I've thought a lot about, especially this week. And I know we'll get to this audio, but I talked to 49ers tight end George Kittle this week about the sort of Purdy versus Christian McCaffrey. And he was making this case that when you consider guys like Christian McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill, and again, it's been a decade since we've had a non-quarterback win this award, that when you consider guys like that, well, they are making defensive coordinators change the way they play the game. And so if you have someone needing to change the game plan against you, then that is of extreme value, this mismatch piece, this chess piece that they're doing. But then I go back and I think about the Eagles 49ers NFC championship game. And I know that there's a difference between going from a great quarterback to a medium quarterback versus like someone who's really not meant to be in the game. But like, look what happened when Brock Purdy wasn't there. And I also have George Kittle telling me, hey, like, Brock Purdy, this is the best the offense has ever been in my time. Like, yeah, we have Kyle Shanahan throughout. We've had a lot of these weapons throughout, but the way he sees the field, the way he fires, the way he's able to understand all the moving pieces and how to exploit them matters. And so I think to me, while physically someone like Christian McCaffrey might change what the defensive coordinator is doing, I think that if you don't have the quarterback seeing the field, which I think Kyle Shanahan described this week as like a God-given gift or however he put it, that's really allowing any of these plays to happen. For me, the question is not about the quarterback touching the ball. It is about the way he needs to see the field and get everyone lined up and do all of these things to even set the foundation for the play to work.
It's a quarterback award. I hear people complain about this where they're like, well, MVP, it's not really open to everybody. It's just open to quarterbacks. No, it's a quarterback league. So it's a quarterback award. There was a time when the NFL was a running back league that existed. And it's not that long ago. Go back 20 years. There was a time when you had LaDainian Tomlinson and Marshall Faulk and Adrian Peterson. I'm talking about these guys at their prime. Emmitt Smith, where they absolutely, the entire offense functioned through this player and they carried offenses. At that time, those players were deserving of an MVP award. And I would even say when Derrick Henry, the 2,000-yard season, in this current format of voting, where you're not just voting for one player, you're going to vote for multiple players, and then it's going to be like the Heisman ballot, where you're going to total all these points. You're going to see non-quarterbacks get votes. And I think even this season, we're going to see a few non-quarterbacks get votes. Your Christian McCaffreys, your Tyreek Hills are going to end up getting votes in the MVP race. But people have to let the league be what it is. It's a quarterback league. The elites at that position are so much more valuable to their teams than the elites at any other position on the field. It's not going to change. So until something flips or a running back comes out and says, all right, you know what, 17 games, let's see if I can put up 2,400 yards or 3,000 yards from scrimmage, or a Tyreek Hill goes, I'm not only going to obliterate 2,000 yards receiving, I'm going to put it in a place where we're going to go decades before the next wide receiver comes out and can alter the landscape. And, oh, by the way, we also have the success on top of it. I'm driving a Super Bowl bus by the end of the season. That's when you will see another player become realistically an MVP candidate who's not a quarterback.
And on that note, the Dolphins won last week, and I know it was against the Jets, but they had no problem. The Jets have a good defense, and they had no problem putting up 30 points against the Jets without Tyreek. And so I think he's a fantastic player and probably deserves Offensive Player of the Year here, Christian McCaffrey. But in terms of MVP, I think we saw a piece of evidence about how much that value means last week.
I think it's important to mention again what C-Rob just talked about. There is some element here of the voting process. For anybody that doesn't know, you used to have one player you could vote for. So all the years that you heard everybody yelling, well, Russell Wilson's never even gotten an MVP vote. It's one of the stupidest conversations in the world because you only got to vote for one person each year.
Thank you so much.
It's not some discredit to Russ. It's just, hey, guess what? That year, you couldn't. It's not like other leagues. They changed that before last season. So now MVP voters like yourselves get to vote for a top 5. That's part of why I thought like Tyreek or somebody might be able to separate if the quarterbacks canceled each other out. That hasn't been the case. But C-Rob, your point about the voting process has to be echoed.
Yeah, thank God you brought that up too, because I mean, for years we have heard people complain. I don't want to hear Chris Collinsworth one more time talk about how Russell Wilson's never gotten an MVP vote in all these great years. Every single year he did not, quote unquote, get a vote. There was another quarterback who had an astronomical season, something historic. Okay, so he was having really top tier years next to someone who was putting a cape on and changing history at the position. So at least in this format, which I love, you're going to see respect go beyond one player. Okay, we're not going to sit there and go, well, Jesus, this player was a unanimous vote for whoever, Lamar Jackson, unanimous MVP or whatever. We're going to be able to look at a block of players and say, hey, these guys all, it's going to matter that Tyreek Hill's going to get some votes. It's going to matter that Christian McCaffrey is going to get some votes because they are deserving. When you look at the MVP race, there's a reflection there that, hey, so this guy won it, but there's a multitude of other players who at least were in the conversation, and being in the conversation, I think, matters.
Right. Yeah. To be clear, I expect both Tyreek Hill and Christian McCaffrey to get plenty of votes now that we have top 5. It's just not going to be plenty of first place votes.
Right. And it's a weighted vote process. But obviously, this is our thoughts on the MVP. But as Jori mentioned, she had the chance to talk to George Kittle earlier in the week. Here are some of Kittle's thoughts on the MVP award.
I'd vote for Christian.
Wow.
Yeah, I would. I see him every day. He's amazing. Everything he does, his mindset, everything. And again, Brock's playing unreal. He has all these first statistical categories.
5. One in first place, but 5. So I can put them both down.
Yeah, no, but yeah, Christian's my number 1. That's the things that he's doing this year are just incredible.
It's a hard argument. Which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? See, Rob, you laugh as a voter. How do you weigh that when Kittle says that? What meaning does it have to you?
I mean, he's not wrong in terms of should McCaffrey get consideration. Are there angles where you can cut it and look at McCaffrey as being the most valuable player on that team? Certainly, yes. Do I think that he is the most valuable player? And remember, it's not just a team award; it's in the league. You're looking at who is maybe the one frustrating thing about this award is there's no real parameters. So everybody looks at it their own way. Some people look at it as, hey, best team if you take this player off, completely changes the complexion of that team. So he's the most valuable player because it's the best team. And this team would be dramatically altered if he were not on the field, which I think you could argue with McCaffrey. You could argue it with Brock Purdy. I think other people go, who's the best player in the league? And I've heard the counter argument to that. Well, you can't just give it to Patrick Mahomes every single year. Okay. But Patrick Mahomes, even in a down year, is still probably the best player in the league. You can't give him the MVP award every single season. So I hear him. And I hear other people's arguments. There's a lot of different ways to approach it. I think that's what makes the award interesting. And it's also why, to be perfectly honest, between Dak Prescott, Brock Purdy, Lamar Jackson, I enjoy at the end of the year calling people across the league and saying, I got a dilemma. Help me sort this out. And then hearing general managers, hearing head coaches, hearing team presidents go, here's why. Let me tell you about how we prepared for this guy. This is why he's so important. This is why he's the MVP. Me personally, I like to put it in other people's hands if it's close. And I feel like particularly this year with these quarterbacks, it's going to be close. So I'm going to go ahead and let other people who prepare for these players, who game plan for them, who surround rosters with players, building teams to make good on their ceilings. I'm going to let those individuals really guide who's the MVP.
No, I'm so glad you said that. Two things. One, on a funny note, I talked to people at the league meetings last week about this, and I'm like, hey, I'm going to be voting for the first time. Who do you think among this? And the first thing that I wasn't expecting was someone being like, hey, my quarterback so-and-so who's in contention, like, please don't give it to him because we're going to have to pay them at some point, and we do not want to have to pay them MVP money. So it's funny because you always expect guys to sort of like, or people, I should say, to be wanting their team to get those awards. And it's like, if you're in the front office, you are very happy to not have to worry about that in contract negotiations. But on a more serious note, I asked someone in the NFC and I said, you hear this argument about like value. So if you put Brock Purdy on the Cowboys offense and Dak Prescott on the San Francisco 49ers offense, do you think the 49ers offense would be better or worse? And do you think the Cowboys offense would be better or worse? And this person told me, and I actually might agree with them. He said, I think both offenses would be worse. And that's what I think that it becomes tricky because it's not that Dak wouldn't do great over the course of time in Kyle Shanahan's system or that Brock Purdy and Mike McCarthy couldn't get to a certain situation, but they're playing the game differently. They're playing different strengths. Lamar Jackson is certainly playing the game differently than both of them. And Josh Allen, if he ends up making this strong case toward the end, which is probably a little late, but I don't think it's impossible for him to at least get in like top 2-3 votes. I think that all of them are playing the game differently. And so then it's so hard to parse out, like in San Francisco, Brock Purdy is statistically the best quarterback in the league right now, but how much does he cancel out with Christian McCaffrey, with Deebo Samuel, with the offensive line, with what his defense is doing to support him and put him in these situations where he could ball out in the way he wants to. And oh, by the way, there are people who think Kyle Shanahan should get Coach of the Year consideration because of the way that his offense and his system continually set people up. So I do think it's hard, but I still think, and I know it's a small sample size, that NFC Championship game last year reminds me that Kyle Shanahan's system with a different quarterback or with all of its other pieces, it doesn't work as well. And I think it was a pretty significant drop-off, one that we saw change the league rule, which means that something had to happen. And had to happen in a really big moment. And so I think to just say, again, as we'll hear from Kittle in a minute, that Brock Purdy as a game manager totally underestimates the way that he is integral to that offense and the way that Kyle Shanahan and the offensive weapons are as well.
Stone, I'm just going to throw Stone, our producer extraordinaire. He's sitting here in the room. Let's just do this. Do we have that, the Kittle and Purdy? This is what Kittle said.
Our offense is the best it's ever been in my career. It's not because, yes, Christian's really good, Deebo's really good, Ayuk's good, I'm good, Juszczyk's good, Juwan Jennings. Like, we have great players, yes. But he's the guy distributing the ball, and he's doing it at such an efficient level that's allowing us to stay on the field. We don't have a lot of 3-and-outs. We're converting on third downs, and our offenses look better than it ever has.
I think all of that speaks to his perspective, which is incredibly important in this conversation. We know that it's incredibly important in this conversation. But I think I have to go back to what C-Rob said a minute ago. Everybody values different things, and that's, I guess, the only bow I feel like I can put on this conversation. I'll use a relationship in my life. Like, I've been lucky enough to be a Grammy voter multiple years, right? And when you start talking about the record of the year, one of the most interesting things about that is everybody values things differently. For me personally, as a music guy, I've always looked at, did you make an impactful memory that lasted a whole generation? So 30 years from now, will somebody hear that song and immediately remember where they were in high school, what that moment was like. And so somebody like Taylor Swift, it's become polarizing for some music people about, well, is she really this, that, the other thing? Like, to me, it doesn't matter. If you've made this moment that matters forever, you are deserving of a Grammy. That's how I always view it. Many of my voting peers do not view it the same. Doesn't make one right or wrong. Like, C-Rob may weigh one thing differently than Jori weighs the other, but that's part of the magic of the award. That's why we don't let bots decide how this goes. Like, I think each of you has to have different things you value. I will ask you this as we put a button on this conversation, whatever you guys are comfortable answering here, but Jori, right now, how do you view the MVP conversation?
Yeah, I think I would say where we are at with 3 weeks left in the season, I think it would be difficult for a non-quarterback to show that they are deserving of this vote with the most valuable player. And I think that what's really fun about this is we have Brock Purdy and Lamar Jackson going up against each other's teams this week. And so that, I think, is going to be a really decisive game in the MVP race for how this looks. I mean, yes, Dak Prescott had been a really serious contender, and a week ago he was the betting favorite. He didn't play well against Buffalo. Now he's got Miami and Detroit coming up, so he still has enough good games that depending on what Lamar and Purdy do, he's not out of this race. But I do think that this game is really going to set the tone for, like, if whoever balls out more between Purdy and Lamar, and I wouldn't even say necessarily just wins the game. Obviously, that is important, but I think it's also really important how they individually play in the offensive play. I think it will then be theirs to lose, most likely.
Yeah, the San Francisco-Baltimore game is going to be huge. I mean, it's Lamar Jackson, I think, has an opportunity here because not only does he play San Francisco, he also plays Miami. There's a 3-game window here, and I feel like the race is close enough between Purdy, Lamar, and I will even put Dak in that because Dak has, as you said, a couple big games remaining on the schedule that they can still impact where these votes go. But I'm telling you, I think it's going to be a really close vote. I'd be shocked if it wasn't. And if it's not, to me, we'll see in the next few weeks, someone will rise and just make it like out of the question that they're not MVP. You know, maybe Baltimore blows out San Francisco, Lamar Jackson goes out and, you know, just absolutely destroys the field. And then you're like, wow, okay, this was the moment now that is going to change a lot of minds of voters. So it's great, though, that you have 3 guys that I think really are in contention here at quarterback who have key games down the stretch that I think can still impact the process.
Sierra, the last thing I want to ask you on this is, okay, so now we have to rank the guys 1 to 5. We're 2 of the voters. You got 48 others. How many of those 50 ballots do you think will have Christian McCaffrey, Tyreek Hill, or both in their 5?
I will bet you it'll be a lot because I feel like when you get past the big 3 quarterbacks right now that are in contention, you end up settling. You're like, wow, okay, well, McCaffrey's got to be in the conversation here. Tyreek Hill's got to be in the conversation here. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see most ballots end up being some combination of Lamar Jackson, Brock Purdy, Dak Prescott, Christian McCaffrey, Tyreek Hill. Like, to me, that's the 5. That's the sort of crown jewels of the players this year. And I think when you get
Josh
beyond
Allen
that,
get in there is the only thing.
Yeah, it was, you know, again, and let's see how the season finishes out for the Buffalo Bills. But I will bet you a lot of ballots will have those 5, and I think almost automatically Offensive Player of the Year is going to come between McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill.
Yeah, and I think the Tyreek injury is a big part of what changes this conversation for me because I really thought that the path to Tyreek winning an MVP wasn't getting the most first-place votes. It was getting everybody's second-place vote on a 2,000-yard season and then have first-place votes that are just sort of split amongst other quarterbacks. That's how I did the math to find a way in my head that Tyreek could sort of sneak his way through, kind of like we see sometimes on Heisman voting. I just think without the chance, I mean, it would take something astronomical to get to 2,000, and we've seen more, like Dak has sort of fallen off. One of these quarterbacks is going to separate. I think it's going to be really hard for Tyreek.
Were you surprised that George Kittle said he thinks Christian McCaffrey deserves the award? I get that he's a skill player and maybe he's pro not being a quarterback only award, but like Brock Purdy is his quarterback. He made a compelling case for what Brock Purdy is doing that is at such a high level in the league. And I don't think we played this part of the audio, but I was like, wow. Like I was shocked, 1, that he was willing to answer it, and 2, that if he answered it, he wasn't going Brock Purdy as like the more obvious, like it's easy to say Brock and Christian not be mad because it's such a quarterback award. And to me, the only teammate who had already said that Christian should be the MVP was Brock when asked what was Christian's case. That was not him that was not like a team-wide campaign at that point. So I was pretty shocked to hear it. And I'm just curious if y'all are.
when you talk about something historic, we talked about this before, what McCaffrey is doing, at least for this era of running backs, is fairly historic. I mean, we don't see guys who are both from a receiving standpoint and a running standpoint so monumentally impactful and then are there every single week doing it, right? Like, you get hurt, you break nowadays when you're that kind of a player. So I think from my perspective, when you're Kittle, you're sitting there and you're staring at a position where it's commonplace now for running backs not to play all season long. It's commonplace to have committees. It's commonplace to have a deficiency in the game of a running back. And yet McCaffrey has none of those. And so I can see why players would be, especially in your locker room, you'd be really, really impressed by that, because a league built to protect quarterbacks, right? So we will see quarterbacks make it the length of the season. It's not built to protect running backs, and it's especially not built to protect running backs who are going to catch, run, and block. And he even blocks. The guy literally is an every down back. If you have the backup running back, if you're playing fantasy and you have a backup running back, never, ever, ever get Christian McCaffrey's backup running back in a season when he's fully healthy, because they're never going to see it. Okay. They're just not. And another thing about McCaffrey too, that's impressive. We went a period of time too, where like, God, man, that guy's great, but he cannot stay on the field. Yeah, he's always hurt. 100%. There's always this injury or that. So what he's doing right now, even in the scope of his own career, is special in terms of this season. This is it. This is like the top shelf McCaffrey that you get. So I can appreciate that teammates would go, man, that he's the dude, and he's doing it in every possible way, and he's showing up every single week. I would probably want to cast my vote for that teammate as well.
Can I be overly logical for a second on this one, just because the way my brain's wired?
Why not? Yeah, let's ruin the show by being logical.
If I'm Kittle,
yeah,
and I got my boys around
being
me.
Logical.
Yeah, no. if I'm Kittle and I got my boy CMC over here and I got my boy Purdy, we talk money because athletes do that. We know bonus structures. I'm sure there's something in CMC's deal that gets him some sort of extra kick if he wins a massive award at the end of the year. On a rookie deal for Purdy, ain't none of that, right? So I know Purdy's going to get his, but I'm also looking over at Christian McCaffrey saying, look, I might not be able to get him the MVP, but I can get him Offensive Player of the Year. And everybody keeps talking about Tyreek. Nobody's paying attention to my guy, CMC. So if I can turn around and create a little buzz around Christian McCaffrey, remind everybody how good he is, helps him win Offensive Player of the Year, which I'm sure gets a little kick, or helps him win MVP somehow miraculously.
3%.
I mean, I'm just saying, like, remember the clip of Gronk going to Brady on the sideline for the last game and was like, man, I just need this one catch to get $1 million. And Brady's like, I'm going to get you that catch. Like, I just looked at it. I was like, hey, this makes a lot of sense. Like, help your boy make a little extra catch. I would do it for either of you. If there was a kicker where I could get either of you nominated for co-host of the year, I would do it.
Who gives the better gifts if they win MVP? Purdy or CMC? It's going to be CMC. He's got more money. So, Purdy, maybe you get $2,000 bottles of Remy across the offensive line and the tight ends. It might be Rollies with CMC. You might be getting a Rolex out of this deal if he wins MVP. So maybe that goes into it.
Purdy's still hoping he doesn't have to buy the offensive line dinner at his contract. Okay, so speaking of quarterbacks, I do want to take a look at one other big conversation that's happening in the league. And C-Rob did a great article on this. One of the most interesting things we're going to face getting into draft season is what the Bears are going to do with Justin Fields. And I don't know the answer to this. So I'll throw to you here, because the interesting part of it is, for most of the year, everybody's been saying, you got the first pick in the draft, you're going to take Drake May or Caleb Williams. It's simple. But the more the Bears continue to play well or continue to look competitive, the less simple it gets, right, C-Rob?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's the external view of this, and then there's the internal view of this. And when I did the piece and I talked to all these general managers, they all share the same feel that's like, hey, we're on the outside looking in. Like, when you're on the inside, you just value players differently. You're there every day. You see impacts guys have in the locker room. You see some of the progress or the mentality of a player. Whereas a lot of these general managers from the outside looking in are just assessing data. They're assessing logic. Like, how do you build teams? What kind of a contract do you want at the quarterback position? How many years are we into this with Fields and still not knowing whether or not we're going to get over the hump? So a lot of it from the outside looking in is logic, but I think there is an agreement that, look, Ryan Poles, the general manager there, he may simply value Fields far differently than anyone else. He may be sitting there saying, no, he's shown up and worked hard every single day. I see from the beginning of the season to the end, these big strides that he's making. I know we're going to get there. And then he has his own plan with how he wants to build around him. We talked about this in prior shows where I said, hey, trade the pick. If you're going to end up with that number 1 overall pick, it appears. Trade that pick and stack all these assets around him. I thought what was interesting was when the story went up, we had seven general managers, right? And they were all unanimous in, trade him, draft Caleb Williams, and then the draft compensation was going to be somewhere in the range of late second, third plus, it was all no, but there was no first round compensation. After the piece went up, a lot of people that I thought were blowing me off started to come, 1 day later they respond, 2 days later they respond. We ultimately ended up with 13 GMs.
13?
What was interesting,
it was 9 last you told me. Wow.
It was 13.
Guys,
yeah, a lot
so
of people
connected.
came in.
What a boss.
Yeah, I don't know about that. And I still had a lot of people who ignored me, by the way. But there were 2 dissenting opinions. It came down, it was 11-2. And there were 2 GMs that said, no, don't deal him. Stick to the plan now. You've seen the progress. Take that pick, turn it into other picks, and just layer that roster around him with pieces. And I also think of those 2, one GM really liked Fields a lot going into the draft. He said that. He said, look, I loved Fields going in. I'm a big Fields guy, so that's kind of why I'm leaning this way. And the other GM, it was just a matter of him. I don't think he likes Caleb. I don't think he likes the idea of rolling the dice on another young player and not necessarily knowing if you're going to be back in this situation where in year 3 you're going, well, what do we do with Caleb? Do we trade him or do we use the high pick we have on another quarterback? So interesting though, to sort of hear all those different assessments and also everyone agreeing though that you really don't know how Ryan Poles values this guy, and that's all that really matters.
I think what's tricky to me is that let's say Justin Fields can be a 7 out of 10 quarterback, which is still very good passing grade. Like he can make plays with his legs, he can make plays out of structure. He'll continue to grow as a passer. Whether or not that's at the rate you want is another story. Let's say he's a 7 out of 10. Now let's say Caleb Williams, Drake May, any of them are 6 out of 10. Well, if you've got a 6 out of 10 quarterback, and you can put all these pieces around him for a lot of money versus 7 out of 10 quarterback taking up a lot of your cap, then you don't necessarily need someone who's going to be better than Justin Fields in the next 4 or 5 years. Unless you think, like, if your goal is to win the Super Bowl, not just to be competitive every year, then you want to figure out what is your best net aggregate of talent. And I think that Justin Fields then needs to be significantly better and a surer bet than these guys coming in, particularly if you're going to have one of those top picks, and particularly in a year when those top picks seem like they're more sure bets than previous years.
Here's the thing though about Fields, and you talk about 7 out of 10, right? The problem with Fields and okay, I think even though we've got a lot of quarterbacks who can do off script stuff, who can operate out of structure, who can be dynamic running the football, and you feel like, hey, that's where the quarterback position's going. That's what everybody wants. But then you look at Anthony Richardson and you go, okay, but this is what happens. Like running is a depreciating aspect in the game of a quarterback. You don't want to continue to have quarterbacks run as they get older. You want them to run less and less and less. So if a big part of your assessment in Fields is his ability to be dynamic and run the football, you're staring at a depreciating asset in his game. So if he's a 7 out of 10 now, what's he going to be 5 years from now? Is he going to be a 4 out of 10 because he can't run anymore? And oh, by the way, it now looks like he can't win games strictly from the pocket. A lot of these GMs that we're looking at Caleb Williams, even though they have problems with a lot of the, so much stuff was out of structure this year for Caleb Williams at USC. The one thing they all said was he has won from the pocket. You can see him win from the pocket. And at the end of the day, if you have a quarterback for 15 years in this league, he is a win from the pocket quarterback. That's just how it works. He's not always going to be the joystick player who's out there running around, because eventually there's going to be some catastrophic injury that changes his career. We saw, he just like Cam, you just wear out taking those accrued hits over time. So it's not just, is Caleb a 6 out of 10? is Justin a 7 out of 10? It's where is that assessment going to be in terms of what depreciates over the next 10 years?
There's also, though, I would argue the financials have to play into this too, in the sense that the worst thing that you can be in the NFL is stuck with a mediocre quarterback that you're paying better than mediocre money. So if he's a 7 and you can sign him for 6 money, 5 money, that's one thing. But in today's world, a 7 quarterback just happens to come up and you end up franchising him. And before you know it, you got Daniel Jones. Like, there is this moment for the Bears where they have the opportunity to get out of the Daniel Jones situation. And maybe that takes risk, but man, I'd rather risk. I honestly believe I'd rather risk rolling the dice again rather than getting into a situation where I'm paying too much for a player that's not worth it.
And Fitz, not only that, you, as one GM said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he was like, and it's interesting too, because it was a GM who was in this situation himself. He was like, man, you're in year 3. Like, you're still trying to figure this out in year 3. He's like, that's not good with quarterbacks. Like, you don't want to be in year 3, particularly. It's one thing if it's like a middle round quarterback. Okay, we've developed him over a number of years or whatever. It's not a middle round quarterback. It's a guy who was chosen at the top of the draft, who those guys, you need to know, like, by year 3, you should know, you should have your answer. And if you don't, that is an answer in itself, that you're still sitting there trying to do the math on a player, not knowing if year 4 is going to be different. And there is a history of quarterbacks in this league, a recent history of guys that teams went into year 3 going, okay, we're still trying to figure it out. Okay. And then year 4 or year 5 proved big mistake to have signed this guy, or great for you that you didn't extend them when you had the opportunity. Like let's say Daniel Jones, right? And how that all unfolded. And then Baker Mayfield with the Cleveland Browns, how that all unfolded. Cleveland could have extended Baker Mayfield after year 3. Instead, they were like, let's wait. We need some more data here. Year 4 said a lot to Cleveland about maybe this extension idea is something we want to go ahead and back burner, and not the wisest thing for us to do at this moment. I think they made the right decision. The Giants, I think you could argue, even though they let it go, obviously, to the end of Daniel Jones' contract before they signed him to that extension, I think you could argue now that the Giants made the wrong decision at a time when they had one season of data with Brian Daboll to go, okay, yeah, we're good.
I think what I struggle with is that I totally agree, or I should say understand where teams are coming from when they say running backs and running heavy quarterbacks are depreciating assets. I think that we heard that a ton last year when all the Lamar Jackson saga was going on, and why there were so many more suitors for Deshaun Watson than there were for Lamar Jackson, because Deshaun Watson's style of play is more sustainable. I had people in front offices telling me, Lamar Jackson, you have to totally change your offense for him, blah, blah, blah. And I know Lamar was hurt last year, but now you have Lamar, totally healthy season, and you have Kirk Cousins, Aaron Rodgers, Joe Burrow, Deshaun Watson, Justin Herbert. Those are not guys who were just creating plays outside of the pocket when they got hurt. These pocket passers are getting hurt too. And I'm not saying they're only pocket passers, but the guys who primarily are playing the game through their arm and not splitting it between their arm and their leg. And so I'm curious, like, is everyone going to get hurt such that it's no longer as much of a depreciating asset, or it's still that much more significant?
Pocket passers can get hurt and come back and be the same player they were. As long as it's not an elbow, as long as it's not a shoulder. You can tear an Achilles. I mean, Tom Brady blew out his knee and then went on and, won how many Super Bowls after that? How many MVPs after that? Like, if you are a player who can win from the pocket, you can win from the pocket, and you don't need to be running around, doing stuff. But if you're a player that has to do some out of structure stuff, that likes to, go off script, you suffer a shoulder injury. You do something on the lower half of your body that affects you in a way that changes how your game ultimately functions. It's like Josh Allen. Like, you don't want Josh Allen running around out there, because eventually he's going to injure a shoulder, and then that's going to change Josh Allen's career. But you love Josh Allen because you go, if you take that away from him, he'll still be okay. I mean, he's got the arm, he can win from the pocket, we think, long term. And that's why, to me, it's not, even though he can run, it's not really a depreciating asset because he doesn't have to do it. He
didn't even have to throw, as we saw this week.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily the Bills' methodology forever moving forward, but it was nice to see. It was nice to see. You guys can check the article out on Yahoo, obviously on the website. It's a great article, deep dive into Fields. And for all you draft weenies out there like me, it's definitely worth the read because we're all going to be paying attention to it. In the meantime, I'm back tomorrow, Zero Blitz. You know that. You can follow us on social media at Jason Fitz, at Charles Robinson, at Jori Epstein, super easy, plus Stone. I mean, you should follow him just because he managed to pull all that up for us on site in the second. At SJ Rochelle is how you get to him. And C-Rob, of course, tell everybody how they can continue to support Terez Paylor's legacy.
Yeah, check out breakingtea.com/Terez. For your all juice tee or hoodie. Remember that proceeds from that purchase go to support the Terez Paylor Scholarship at Howard University. You can also give to that scholarship directly, as well as the one in Terez's name at Missouri, if you check out our podcast description.
And while you're hanging out with the podcast, be sure to leave us that 5-star review. We genuinely appreciate it, unless you don't like the show, in which case, don't leave us a review. 5 stars only. That's the rule. All right. It's just like Uber. You can also rate and subscribe. Tell your friends, your family, your enemies. Tell everybody to hang out with us. I promise we won't be as chaotic as the Uber drives I keep referencing at this point. We will be back next Wednesday with more inside coverage. Thanks for hanging out with us, y'all.